Hello, and welcome to our web panel, Reversing the Teacher Workforce Shortage, with recommendations for recruiting and retaining a diverse workforce. Our panel will be moderated by Dr. Francesca Lopez, who is the Waterbury Chair in Equity Pedagogy in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at Penn State University. She began her career in education as a bilingual elementary teacher and later as an at-risk high school counselor in El Paso, Texas. I'll hand it off to her to get us started today. Thank you.
Who co-directs the Research to Policy Collaborative at Penn State University. And as you saw in the invitation, we know there's been a steady and pretty significant decline of enrollment in teacher preparation programs over the past decade. And this tends to have the most troublesome consequences for schools that are in urban and rural Title I districts. In part, this is because schools have to resort to employing uncertified teachers almost 4 times as often as those in suburban schools. And they also end up employing teachers with fewer experiences that help promote retention. So today's panel is going to focus on 3 key barriers, which are recruitment, matriculation, and retention. And we have our panelists providing evidence on what is contributing to the high rates of turnover and declining enrollments, as well as some strategies to address some of the teacher workforce dilemmas. We have, Taylor, did you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Taylor Scott. I co-direct the Research to Policy Collaboration, which is a model for bridging connections between researchers and policymakers by starting with first understanding what legislators are interested in, the policy agenda, and supporting those existing goals in an agenda neutral way by bridging you guys with some trustworthy researchers across the country. So thank you for that little introduction, Francesca.
Yeah, and I'd like our panelists to introduce themselves, and we can go in alphabetical order. So we can start with Dr. Adrienne Dixon.
Hello, everyone. Happy to be here. Thank you, Francesca and Taylor, for hosting this wonderful event. I am a professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the Department of Education Policy, Organization, and Leadership. I study broadly urban education reform in the South, and have a line of my research. I'm interested in the experiences of African-American teachers and how they engage with changes and reforms, particular education reforms in post-Katrina New Orleans is a specific line of my research. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you. We're excited to have you. Dr. Jeremy Garcia.
Morning or good afternoon. I'm Jeremy Garcia. I'm also a faculty associate professor at the College of Education at the University of Arizona. I'm also co-founder, co-director of the Indigenous Teacher Education Program. And I was a former teacher as well. And so taught several years working with one of the tribal communities named Salt River, Pima, Maricopa, just outside of Phoenix. I am a member of the Hopi and Tewa community where I was born and grew up in my community. So I'm really fortunate to have that lived reality to really guide the work that I do in my own research, which is a focus on Indigenous education, in particular looking at not just Indigenous teacher education, but also looking in terms of critical Indigenous pedagogies and curriculum within our learning spaces for Native communities. So I appreciate the invitation.
We're glad to have you here as well. Javier Lopez.
Thank you. I'm Director of Strategic Partnerships at Penn State University College of Education. My background has been extensively focused on recruitment and retention strategies in urban and I'd say rural school districts in Arizona, Wisconsin, and now here in Pennsylvania. I work closely with faculty, primarily to kind of think about sustainable programs that address community needs. That I would love to talk in more detail here, but essentially I still work with school districts across Pennsylvania to look for strategies in retaining teachers and recruitment as well.
Thank you. We're excited to have you here as well. And of course, Dr. Angela Valenzuela.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Angela Valenzuela, And I'm faculty in the College of Education at the University of Texas within the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy. I have a courtesy appointment as well as in curriculum and instruction, Native American Studies, and Mexican American Studies. And I'm very involved in community-based education. We have a Saturday school, Academia Cuautli. It's a partnership, really strongly in partnerships, and what they can bring to these kinds of questions and issues that we're asking today. And so we're in our entering our ninth year of partnership between our community-based organization, the Austin Independent School District, and the City of Austin Parks and Recreation Center, where our school is physically located. What we do is we prepare teachers to teach a co-constructed curriculum that is anchored in indigeneity, in civil rights, in local histories. We focus on a curricula that is specific to the needs of the parents and the children, and we make it available district-wide such that we have systemic impacts. It's taken up mostly by the dual language, bilingual education program, and of course we know that the dual language bilingual education programs are in crisis, have already been in crisis, but now even more so with what's happening. And so I'll focus a lot of my remarks from that vantage point of teacher retention. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Taylor.
Thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited about this excellent panel lineup. I did want to do a little bit of housekeeping for our attendees before we get started. Please note that the Research to Policy Collaboration is nonpartisan and independent entity. We emphasize the use of empirical evidence in policymaking. As such, we will not discuss political questions or questions that are irrelevant to the focus of this panel. We also encourage respectful audience participation through the Q&A feature of this event, as well as you can provide thumbs up to existing questions in the Q&A menu. I think some of you have already demonstrated you know how to use the Q&A feature, but I believe that there's also a thumbs up feature if you want to bump up existing questions, and that we can prioritize questions that are particularly popular. You may also enable captions during today's event using the Zoom menu for live transcripts. So now to get started, we will, I think we'll have Francesca kick us off. Any further description about the event that you may want to provide?
So the only thing I'll add, since I've already discussed the goals of the event, is there's, and I'm happy to provide this link, the Economic Policy Institute provided a very nice infographic. It's a visual that shows how underpaid teachers are in each state. And there isn't a single state that pays teachers on par with other comparable college educated workers. And so the disparity spans anywhere between 0.2% and almost 33% less. So it just varies wherever you are in the state across. And I'm happy to provide that link in the chat shortly, but we're going to jump right into our panelist questions so we can get that moving along. And so we're going to start off with the question, what are current challenges in teacher recruitment? What solutions or recommendations would be beneficial in addressing these challenges? So that's the overarching question. And so we're going to start with Javier Lopez on that.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. I have a lot to say on this. So I'm going to try to race through this as quickly as possible. And I'm going to be speaking mostly from macro, but a little micro as well. Hopefully the Q&A will give us that opportunity, but I'm going to jump into it. The movie Field of Dreams with Kevin Costner, build it and they will come. That's how most universities and schools operated 20 years ago, but with funding cuts to budgets, they've had to adjust and be more proactive. Now, some are doing it better than others, and then some are not doing it at all, which is kind of strange, but I think that will change. Now, the first thing we need to do is be proactive. I drove to rural school districts, rural border school districts, and urban. And rural school border school districts, we invited Dr. Angela Valenzuela to speak, and she was amazing as always. It was great to see her down in Bisbee. You have to engage school leaders, community leaders on a consistent and regular basis. but many university recruiters, and I would say even school districts, are still reluctant to drive and work in these communities. Now, that may seem normal to me, but that's not fair. My initial career started in corporate sales in top Fortune 500 and top Fortune 200 companies, and it provided me with highly sophisticated training. And so you have university recruiters who don't have that kind of training and background. And so schools and universities really need to change the way they recruit and the way they think about it. Start the pipeline much earlier. Spend more time in high schools talking to students about the appeal and rewards of a gratifying career in teaching. But that will require university school districts to allocate higher percentage of their budgets to hiring and building a recruitment team, so they're being proactive and going out there searching for the candidates to come. And again, I can talk about more of the micro level as much as possible, but I'm trying to get this all wrapped up. The long-term strategy, to be honest, and I can go into more details about the micro piece of it, but the long-term strategy really is we need to pay teachers a lot more money. Start them off at $100,000. In California and New York, maybe 125. As I said earlier about the field dreams, build it and they will come. I say pay them well and they will come. You won't need people like me or recruiters, because you're going to have a line of candidates going to schools applying, because there are a lot of people already who would love to go into teaching, but they can't afford it because they have to raise a family. And so principals are going to have a ton of applicants. They're going to actually have to turn them away. And so there's a lot of great things, and I'm only going to cover a couple of them, but a lot of great things that come from this. We talk about teacher prep programs. Guess what? You're going to see a huge spike in enrollment, because now people know that teachers are being respected and rewarded for going into a very noble profession. And so those numbers are going to speak. And so there's a plethora of stuff when you start funding schools. And so one of the things I have to do is shift the federal budget to education. We have billions and billions of dollars of money to spend, and so we can fund schools lavishly. What this is going to require is a national conversation and courageous legislators to advocate on behalf of their constituents and communities to fund schools significantly higher than they are now. Pay the school districts, fund them well, and they will come. Thank you.
Do any of our panelists want to add to the recruitment issues?
Well, I have some thoughts about that. I mean, there is research that shows that it's important to tap into the motivation of students of color. A lot of students of color want to give back to their communities. And so this would connect to what Javier just said about the teachers that, I mean, were it not for a good salary, they would be coming, right? It's not the motivation issue. It's not, being valued. Ultimately, it is about how much we value teachers, right? And so I'm not an expert on teacher licensing tests, but I know that there was a case out of New York that was just one that showed that the existing licensing tests equated to employment discrimination, and that passage rates are very low by race, or they're disparate by race. And so we have to understand equity. Go ahead. I'm sorry. So, and then the other is that I don't know if people have heard of support that for normalista programs, the normal programs, the teachers that come from other countries like Mexico, or places in Latin America. There has been supports, private and I believe federal funding for such programs, including one that existed a number of years ago in our own college and university called Proyecto Maestría. And so that really taps into the immigrant community, many of whom are highly educated, but they need to be able to translate that education into credentials and certifications here. There's also Teacher Corps is a remaining vestige of the War on Poverty program that would be amazing if we could revive it as a model for other states. To my knowledge, it's only kind of like happening in California. And I think that we should incentivize, for example, for the bilingual dual language teachers, incentivize them getting hired by giving them stipends. I know some districts have that they have that in other school districts. I mean, they don't even think about it. But I think also we need to work with the for-profit and the nonprofit sectors both. I mean, this is like a crisis that we're in, to get teachers from Mexico and Central America. A concern would be of a lack of compatibility sometimes, or like a lack of real sensitivity, because they're not from here. And so I think we would have to pay attention to, in the process, the fact that there are differences between teachers that we might recruit that at the end of the day might kind of not be optimal, just considering the lack of cultural competence of some aspects of the teacher workforce. So it's not a long-term solution, but it is a Band-Aid.
Thank you for that. And I think I'd just like to add, to what you're mentioning about the licensing and certification. There was a meta-analysis done quite some time ago by Jerry D'Agostino that showed that those exams were not very predictive at all as far as quality of teachers that were produced, but that GPA of their teacher program, not of their 4 years in university, but of the teaching specific program, were indicative. And it seems that, policy changes went the opposite way. They started requiring more assessments when the evidence really wasn't there to support that. So thank you for that comment. I have another follow-up question, but I wanted to make sure Dr. Garcia or Dr. Dixon, if you had anything else to add.
I just add for the recruitment is that, when we're thinking, and I'm going to speak specifically from working with Native teacher candidates in our program, in two different contexts. One, it was my prior appointment at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, where I was also an endowed professor with the American India, like the Quinney Institute. And the whole goal of that institute was to strengthen this very point that we're having conversations around today. And in that context was an urban setting where we were looking at how do we reach and engage with the diverse tribal nations throughout the state of Wisconsin to create that pathway for certification. And I think, and so that's one context, and the other is in Tucson, where I'm currently at. And there is a similar nuance that's happening, which is, even though there is some support mechanisms in terms of funding, federal funding that's been allocated, and it's a competitive grant since the late 1990s, and I can speak a little bit more about that later. But so there was some funding strands, and it was about creating a mechanism that could support the students so that they could earn their potential degrees, etc. However, we found that you would think candidates would be, as Javier spoke to, lining up at the door, but that isn't the case. And when I see these two particular instances, there's something else that's signifying that needs to also be analyzed, which is also thinking about the systemic and the historical context that impacts recruitment, for diverse communities. And in this case, with Native communities, many of them are first generation. Oftentimes they come with families. So all of those various factors, I think, play a role in this. And so I think it's important for us to consider, the ways in which policy and or funding can also prove as a limitation for, those pathways for students to enter the academy to earn a degree. So I would just add that briefly here.
Thank you. And just making sure, Dr. Dixon, did you have anything to add?
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
I had one more item.
Sure.
Real quickly. There is now a building body of research that shows the power of grow your own educator programs to bring in community-based educators. And I would underscore community, because they're not going to go anywhere. They're from the community, which means that by recruiting from the community, you also contribute to the retention, of the teachers, which I think was somewhat of what you were talking about earlier, Jeremy, as well, with the Native American.
I think that's such an interesting idea politically too, because all policy is local, and you're talking about local recruitment efforts and how to build communities within the areas that need it. Just wanted to comment there from a sort of policy angle.
Mhm. Are we ready to jump into question 2? So the overarching question is, what are current barriers to successful teacher training and program development, and what solutions or recommendations would be beneficial in addressing these barriers?
I'll be opening this question up, but I think I'm going to speak from my observations of the prior experiences with both the efforts at UW-Milwaukee, but also more so looking specifically at the ITEP program. And maybe for those who are joining a little late, it's the Indigenous Teacher Education Program at the University of Arizona. And it began with this community-based meeting where we invited all 22 nations in the state of Arizona, representatives from the directors of education of their tribes, to also tribal liaisons who are working within public schooling spaces in Phoenix, Tucson, surrounding area, to have this conversation around what are their goals, what are their interests around Indigenous education, and what are the needs and the desires. And so out of that was born, obviously, was that core question. And at the time, Dr. Francesca Lopez was there, so she knows a little bit about this history, and they spoke very specifically that we needed more Native teachers serving their Native students, and for a variety of reasons. And part of those reasons were there was a disconnect between the type of teachers that were coming and going within their particular community context. And what they were really striving for is for candidates who understood their communities as being sovereign, understood their community's history, understood the Indigenous language revitalization goals and needs, and understood the idea of around how do we infuse that within Indigenous knowledge and value systems within the kind of preparation that we offer to our teacher candidates. And even if they were Native, they were speaking to the idea that it wasn't always guaranteed that they were going to return to their community with that sort of mindset to engage that in a balanced way. One, there's still the academic goals that they were striving for, but they're also something much larger about sustaining their Native, the idea of indigeneity was mentioned earlier, but it's also about Native nation building as sovereign entities. And so how are we preparing our Native teacher candidates to live into that? And that here's where we then grew as a program to look back in terms of the coursework and the course design in programming and what was being offered. And we found that what we had to engage our teacher candidates in was a self-reflective process. And there needed to be a certain space for that to happen because of the history. Many of them grappled with, why don't I speak my language fluently, just like myself? Why is it that, we're seeing a decline in our languages, but also cultural practices and protocols? And so, a lot of tears were shed, so there's a deep passion about sustaining that. But programmatically, we weren't at a place at the institution. And this isn't necessarily a critique of my colleagues who grew alongside us as an institution, who were thinking through together, well, how do we carve out these spaces so that it can happen? So what happened with the first cohort of teacher candidates in our program was, they were overloaded with courses, and they were taking additional 2 courses for myself and the co-director, Dr. Valerie Shirley, on top of the regular elementary education program. So that there was a disservice, but we know they needed that extra 2 courses to really unpack and center their indigeneity throughout the programming. Over time, where we are now, we've since continued to grow and think about how do we continue to find balance in that. And so I think, thinking back about my own personal experiences of being at an institution and getting my certification to teach, I didn't have anything that was centered on American Indian or Native American content. If it was a history. If it was only content and not about pedagogy. So there's a very unique distinction in that process. So there's a convergence that needs to happen in terms of the pedagogy and curriculum, as well as the content. And so for teacher training programs, and I'll end with this, last summer, we had a national effort to really bring various communities together throughout the nation to have this conversation around a bill that's going to be put forward in the coming months, the Native American Teacher Education Pathway Bill. But we wanted unique perspectives on what they thought teacher education should be. And for them, out of that, I think one of the goals is that there is a growing effort for Native nations to want to be in the driver's seats to co-construct what that process is like. And so I think that, when we're looking at, program development, teacher training, it has to be in conversation with Native communities, but also I think with diverse communities in general. So I'll leave it at that for my colleagues to speak from their position in terms of programming.
Thank you. And I mean, Dr. Dixon, Dr. Valenzuela, or Mr. Lopez, I guess the follow-up question is, I mean, are programs reflective of the communities they're meant to serve? And we know that that's often no, right?
Right. So I wanted to say I was really interested in this particular question. I do think, and I am currently sitting in New Orleans that's been plagued by a number of reform policies that have had a negative impact on traditional teacher education. And so, like Jeremy, I mean, there's a conundrum, right? We know that traditional teacher ed has been an issue in terms of recruitment and retention and matriculation of teachers of color. But in New Orleans, we've been overrun by alternative programs that are just alternatives. So they haven't necessarily addressed the issues that Jeremy raised relative to helping teachers locate, place, respect culture, and for teachers of color, particularly in a place like New Orleans, where folks have come from all over the place, they may identify as African American, but they're completely disconnected from the history and culture and language of New Orleans and Louisiana writ large. And we actually have a very robust Native community and have always had a wonderful relationship between the Indigenous community and African Americans, but folks wouldn't know that history. And so you get a onslaught of transplanted teachers in a context with an anemic teacher ed program. It's the children who suffer. And so we're really struggling with that here. And HBCUs in particular have been hit hard with education reform efforts that have sought to do teacher training external to universities. And so the alternative programs, while they look attractive, have actually in many ways been detrimental because they have the same bureaucracies and requirements that in many ways frustrate the full inclusion of teachers of color. So what's interesting here in Louisiana is that the state has allowed individual charter schools to identify their own LEA to partner with and do teacher education. So essentially they can license teachers on their own. That again has had a number of issues because we haven't seen more teachers of color necessarily go through, and the ones who go through. In fact, I'm working with some teachers now, who and I've with a number of African American teachers who are trying to just figure out what is it that they want me to do, because they have they have a high desire to teach kids of color, African American kids in particular, but they don't understand what the program is, quote unquote, training them to do because it's unrecognizable to them just in terms of the rituals, not the rituals, but the expectations seem to be disconnected from engaging with kids and learning communities, in large part because the people who have designed these programs are not local. So we have big fly-by-night, nonprofit organizations that have descended on alternative teacher education and frame themselves as kind of local or grassroots or community-based, and they're not, and they're just replicating these practices. So I want to call traditional programs to task for doing a better job of recruitment and retention and thinking about these issues again, place and identity and language and engagement with families. I think that's important. They're hampered by restrictions at the state level often. And then you have alternative programs that again are not connected to communities. They're just better, they're just more, they have more money and more context. And we're creating more I think there are more problems for teachers and students of color. And we're trying to figure out kind of how do we work around these things to create experiences for people to learn to teach in our communities and learn from our kids and our families, where it's a collaborative process of learning. And I think it's a longer arc than we, traditionally think of, but I think we can think of it in phases. I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff that I would love to say about how we can think about licensing teachers if we have to, but I think it's fraught. And I think for teachers of color, it's especially fraught. We have to be careful what we're arguing for and what are the potential pitfalls.
Thank you.
I have a question, and I know we need to move on, so sorry to add to this, but I hear a theme from both Jeremy and Adrian that there's some bureaucratic requirements and around traditional pedagogy that may be causing some difficulty of trying to create more adaptive, culturally based curricula as an example. My naive question is, well, who's responsible for creating the bureaucracy? What are the kind of policy levers there? What do you hope to see?
And I'll give time to Jeremy. I'll just say, from my observation, working at state universities, is that often there's a menu of things that courses that teachers have to take, right? So they're a litany, and it depends on who is the strongest lobby. When I was in Ohio State, our literacy folks were particularly strong, and so students had an inordinate amount of courses to take in language and literacy and reading, which is important, but it was a huge percentage of their coursework. And the lobby was strong enough that became, you can only get licensed I'm making this up, if you had 45 hours of teaching, reading, and writing, and general literacy courses. And that becomes a bear, right? Because there are particular ideologies that people have around language and literacy that may or may not reflect children's native languages. And so students, and for teachers of color who maybe they're native speakers of their language, or maybe they're not, it's still, it's a challenge for them. But by law, right, according to the state, you won't get your license unless you go through these 45 hours of language and literacy courses. That's just an example. I mean, they're certainly a professional practice. I think there are a lot of, for traditional programs, the state has a lot of requirements, I think, that have little to do with actually being a teacher. And some of it could be embedded in practice, in clinical experiences and whatnot.
If I could add to all the panelists here, I agree with in terms of working in these communities. And one of the things that's really difficult for a lot of universities right now to kind of reconceptualize what that means in terms of delivery of instruction. And so here at Penn State, we're in the process, College of Education, creating the Teachers in Residence program. One of the things that you have to do is go out to these communities. One of the things that I learned in Douglas, Arizona, growing your own, is one of the great things about building your own, from people who were born and raised or live in these communities. They look at the students from an asset base, the strengths of the students. They don't think oh no, that's that little Jose, he's a good kid, he's really smart, he just needs to redirect his attention. And so they understand all the opportunity. They also understand some of the challenges, but what those opportunities are. And so they work with them. And then the retention piece, as Dr. Valenzuela talked about, you see the retention rates much higher with those who live in the communities that they were raised and born in. So I think that's effective. And so the way that we're thinking about this stuff is the teachers in residence program has to be flexible. We are going to deliver new programming in Reading, Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, Philly, Allentown. And so there has to be a hybrid flexibility built into it. It has to be affordable. We're working on making it affordable, and it has to be shorter so that it's not taking, a lot of these people are working. And as Dr. Dixon had mentioned, these alternative certification programs, these for-profits act like they're from the community, but they necessarily don't. And so we're working on shortening the curriculum because many of these teachers are already working, but we're not watering down the curriculum. And I have to say that our dean, Dr. Kim Lawless, and Associate Dean, Dr. Rains Burley, have been not only supportive, but pushing and advocating for innovative way of thinking. And that's not regular kind of thinking. And so you have to have leaders who are pushing for change in order for us to address specific community needs within each location across the country, I think.
Yeah, I would just like to add that I think that, K-12 teacher preparation, recruitment, retention, it really just lacks a soul. And it expresses with bureaucratic logics, and it seems like it's a technical, rational kind of accomplishment that we're seeking. When I really like what Jeremy was saying, Dr. Garcia, about the Native American program. What I hear is that it is about, definitely about, kind of like infusing pedagogy with, culturally relevant and sustaining kind of awareness and knowledge that's asset-based. But it's deeper than that, right? Where it's about, like really like connecting it to what communities want and seek. I just spent a week in Oaxaca, Mexico, and it was so beautiful to see people out of the teacher. It isn't the teacher preparation program, it's the foreign language or the Language Institute, where they're preparing Indigenous teachers for Indigenous schools. It was amazing because, for so little money, it's incredible. They are so passionate about preserving Indigenous languages, many of which don't even have an alphabet yet. It's a linguistically rich environment. Migration is killing these languages because people leave. And so there's a real deep urgency about not letting these languages die. And there's a lot of work around that. And so I think that's what's really missing. And without that kind of expressive, that passion that drives K-12 recruitment, I think again, connected to community issues and needs and challenges, but also driven by community needs and talents and organizations. I think that we're always going to fall short.
Thank you for that. So our next question is focused on retention, and you all have really been discussing some of the gatekeeping issues, the lack of soul, right, in these programs because of very traditional ways of ensuring teachers are prepared that don't necessarily align with the communities they're supposed to serve. And certainly you mentioned how this contributes to retention issues, but what is the scope of this issue related to retention? To what extent are we losing teachers? How does that affect student learning? Just opening up to discussion why this very issue of bringing in teachers and keeping them is of the utmost importance.
Yeah. I'll start. Sorry. Oh, am I jumping over someone? Wasn't supposed to start. So I think there is a confluence of issues. So I thank you for raising the EPI report on teacher salary. I didn't know they had done that. Again, I sit here in New Orleans with a young teacher force and a teacher force that is constantly shifting because many are recruited by programs that only imagine them to be teachers for 2 years. So that's the kind of big name program. And then there's a quote unquote local one that's a cousin of the program where they're recruiting teachers to be stopgaps. And so their training is minimal, if at all, and they're supposed to get it along the way. But many just don't know what they're doing. And there isn't support in the school. So I talk about kind of intergenerational teachers. So if you're a first year teacher and the most senior person in your building has taught for 3 years, there isn't a wisdom of practice there, right? And your principal has only been in the field for 3 years. They were a teacher for 2 years, and this is your first year as a principal. They may be a veteran principal at 5 years, but they aren't a veteran educator, right? Because we have taken on this model, as Angela spoke earlier about a kind of technical model of education, that it's just managing budgets, managing people, managing policies, and the art and the beauty of teaching and engaging with young people and their families is kind of lost, and connecting that learning to something bigger than the state test scores, right? And so it's very functionalist here in New Orleans. And I was talking to a young teacher who she says her stomach hurts. She's going into her second year. And she did her first year as a, she was a secondary teacher. So she had a lead teacher, and she was supposed, it's in a model that they're adopting, that I think that they're bastardizing actually, where you have a lead teacher, but the lead teacher had only been teaching for 2 years. And then you're supposed to apprentice under this teacher. But at any rate, her stomach hurts every day when she goes to school. And she's, because she's worried that she's going to get something wrong. And by getting something wrong, it's some inane policy or practice that this particular charter management organization has adopted. And one is the no nonsense nurturers, where you have kids track their eyeballs. You narrate all of, I like how Johnny is, Johnny, will you know, and so these practices are foreign to her. They don't make sense. She's a native New Orleans. She's like, I don't understand this. And yet if she doesn't do them, and has gotten, kind of chewed out for not following these practices. That's a retention issue, right? That's a climate issue. And it's almost like a Stepford school. Like, she was like, I don't know who I can talk to. I don't know who I can trust. And so the schools aren't a place where among teachers there's camaraderie, because it's, if you don't toe the line, you're going to be out of here. One of my good friends who has a PhD and decided to come to New Orleans and teach, was told she wasn't a fit. She's been a teacher she has a new school every year for 4 years. She has a PhD, and clearly understands content, but she wasn't a fit. She wasn't a fit. We just don't think you're a fit. Well, it turns out she had raised their 8th grade social studies scores by over 8 points. But they had dismissed her in March. When the scores came out, she said they sent her another contract. And she was like, she thought she was out of a job in March. Scores came out in May. They sent her a contract in June. And she was like, what is, but she wasn't a fit. And it's these it's I say that, it's destabilizing. Schools here are destabilizing for teachers on purpose. Many sign confidentiality agreements, so you can't talk about salary, or it's actionable. So there are, and I don't think this is not unique to New Orleans. I think places where teachers have no labor rights, and that's increasing as districts are less interested in protecting the labor rights of teachers, that you have these destabilizing, and why would anybody want to stay? I mean, loving children is not enough to subject yourself to working in conditions like that.
Well, wow, that's pretty despairing. So I think my best way to answer this question about teacher retention was, in fact, a teacher retention crisis that we had, we still have it, but for the bilingual dual language programs within the Austin Independent School District back in 2013. And we also, like Jeremy described, we also had a community meeting, and I organized it with the Texas Center for Education Policy that I directed. We held it in a community space, and we were really intentional with who we invited. We invited the teachers, people who were into like children's books, community advocates, historians, archivists, understanding that a lot of the issues in teacher preparation, as you've already heard, have precisely to do with teachers and children not seeing themselves in the curriculum or in the higher education program, being dismissed, and our histories, our identities, our reflective practices not being a part of what teacher preparation and teaching is. And so we had this meeting, and I didn't quite expect what would come out of it. It was pretty open-ended, but what came out of it was that we need to create a space, and we call it a third space. So it's sort of between the overprescribed space of the school and the underprescribed space of the home, so that you can have a middle space where there's freedom, right? And so there's no judgment here either. I mean, I think there's so many different approaches, but we felt that if we were in a school or an institution like higher ed, that it would be iterative of its own values and discourses, and that we would have more opportunity being within a community space where we can develop our own curriculum, ways of knowing, a mission statement that reflected our values. And so what we valued and what we wanted in our earliest breaths was freedom, freedom to do what we do, in fact. And what has grown out of that has been, in fact, promotion ladders. We haven't lost anyone in 9 years of tracking the teachers. We're going into our 9th year, but we've been in existence for 10. We haven't lost any teachers. If we lose them to either higher ed. We've probably recruited well over 20 master's and doctoral students through our specific work into higher education, and mostly doctoral students in policy and in curriculum instruction, bilingual education, or we lose them to district opportunities. So career ladders are really important, right? And so as a community, we've been able to raise funds to address targeted needs. So during the pandemic, a major crisis for our bilingual dual language teachers, because a lot of the resources that were available through the school assumed that you had literacy when you didn't. I mean, much less a computer or a connection to the internet. And so being anchored in the community, we were able to raise resources, including for digital equity needs that our parents had, that the district was insensitive to. I mean, frankly, it was insensitive. They told us we have no resources for this. Mm-hmm. So we had to go and get resources and help teachers, the teachers that we worked with, get launched with the parents, with parents who didn't know what a page was, a website. They didn't have basic kinds of computer knowledge, that even access to the mainframe, to the main, to the main website for the district assumes that. And it's not even in English or Spanish. I mean, these are profound kinds of issues that if you don't have people on the ground to address them and to troubleshoot and to bring resources, they go unmet, right? And so again, I'm a strong advocate for partnerships. It doesn't mean that universities can't be centered. Like, I really appreciate the work of teacher preparation that is culturally relevant and sustaining. But again, I think a deeper lesson here is the importance for keeping teachers within education, for retaining them when they have direct supports from people in the community who feel their pain, who understand it, because we work shoulder to shoulder. It's very granular, very very intimate kind of work that we do in our space.
If I could just add, you can't run schools like companies, a profit and loss type of situation. As Dr. Dixon said, it's destabilizing, but it's also dehumanizing to teachers and students. These schools miss out on an opportunity to personalize, connect with the students, with the teachers, with the parents in these communities. I think that this curriculum piece is really important in terms of retention and addressing those issues. I think it's extremely important. We need to really start personalizing the curriculum for each community and not run them like private companies where kids are and teachers are profit and loss type of situation statements.
in looking at time, I just want to be sure, I mean, we're hearing some of the solutions, but some key takeaways that you'd like our participants who are here with us today to take with them. What recommendations do you have for our audience in terms of what is needed to recruit the kind of teachers that are needed in classrooms and to keep them there?
I'll start. I think programs, or I hate to say I'm thinking about programs, but I'll say contexts where teachers are able to, look for teachers of color, I'll say, are able to connect to families and communities in really meaningful ways. I'm working with some teachers now, and we work with them during the week, and then we host an event on Fridays. I'm missing it now, but we host an event on Fridays. We provide food. We engage in dialogues and events, activities with families. We do intergenerational work. So I think designs where it's authentic, engagement with communities, learning communities. I think teachers have to be grounded and connected, and it can't. It should be more than a one-off event, but it should be a theme that is significant, because teachers, for the most part, they want that. And I'll just say some of the young people that have at least been drawn to New Orleans do have a sense of mission, and they want to be connected, and they want to feel like they're making a difference. And so I think folks who work with teachers should consider ways that the engagement with families and communities is foregrounded and centered, as opposed to a kind of ancillary piece of it. And then the compensation, I think, is incredibly important. Obviously, people have to have some place to live. They need to be able to, they shouldn't be struggling. So we need to think about, how do we pay them so that they can live according to the standards that are in the cities in which they find themselves.
Thank you. Dr. Garcia, Dr. Valenzuela, or Mr. Lopez have anything to add?
I'll just add, I'm sorry, so much has been shared. Maybe I'm gonna lose the focus of your little question, but I think, there's just so much that has been shared today from my colleagues that has been beneficial to me as well in our programming, but it's also about building solidarity across various communities. And this is inclusive of non-diverse communities and educators who have the interest, but also need the ongoing guidance. So beyond, there's so many things. There's the salary, there's the investment, but also I think just thinking for us as a program, we look at our candidates as the future, not just of being educators, but we are also hold ourselves accountable for who's that next generation of who's going to be entering the academy to lead these kinds of programs so that it's sustainable. So there's much more into this long-term picture that I think has to begin now. And the way we do it right now for us is we encourage them to pursue graduate school, just as was shared earlier. But the problem with that is we don't want to also pull them out of classrooms where they're also needed. So there's also new programming and design that still has to happen. But I think the other piece is to think outside of the box about who we consider as an educator, or as a teacher educator. I should be more specific on that. We have typically in the academy, it's professors or professors of practice. But when you think about our diverse communities, and I'll speak specifically about Indigenous communities, we're trying to revitalize, recenter, reclaim our knowledge and value systems. And a lot of times it is our elders and our local knowledge holders who have that access to that knowledge to shape our thinking, our candidates' thinking. And so that's knowledge that you can't find in a textbook. That's knowledge you can't find in an academic setting or an institutional setting. It has to be in places of the community, as was shared as well by my colleagues. So, I think just being creative about, what is it that our diverse communities need, and to be in conversation with them about that process. And then thinking about one last piece I'll add is just to think about, and we just came off a meeting with the Superintendent Kathy Hoffman about 2 weeks ago, with the idea to think about, there's an endorsement that we're probably working to tease out that has an Indigenous education focus. Because what we're seeing is that it would allow us potential flexibility, because right now our students are either in a ESL track or a bilingual, and our students don't necessarily fit in either because they are coming from an Indigenous context in terms of revitalization and so forth that I named earlier. So I think thinking about being creative in the different venues and avenues that our policies can take up to that impact how institutions design their coursework and programming. So I'll leave it at that.
I would just add, just as a reiteration, is really we have to spend time in the communities that we want to serve. A lot of great things that happen from that. You get students from K through 12, high school students who may be interested, who want to stay in their communities, stay there. And so you also find individuals who want to come back to their communities, and providing programs that allow them to come back, even if they have a degree in a different area, I think is really important. And again, I will say this over and over, we've got to pay teachers significantly more. We've got to fund schools. There's no way around that. It's about funding, period. You fund schools can then pay teachers better. And a plethora of great things will happen when we do that. And until we get to that point, and I hope that we will, I think some of these strategies that we've talked about will help school districts and universities attract a diverse select of teachers around the country.
Speaking for myself, I know a number of women who have left teaching profession because they can make considerably more working in a business or real estate or what have you.
And they're leaving a profession they love for teaching for another profession that may not be as gratifying to them, but they have some realities they've got to face. And so that's unfortunate. And I think that's a lost opportunity that I think we can solve.
I definitely second that with what I've seen. I mean, even like the childcare dilemma, if your paycheck is only paying for childcare, then what are you really doing?
Mm-hmm.
We need a social movement, and policy has to be part of this, right? That's what inspires, that's what motivates. And so you don't get into teaching as a destination, but you see it as like something that's creative from a policy perspective, because we have to address this at all levels, right? At the school, at the district, at the state level, at the federal. We need resources for grow your own educator programs. Teachers deserve higher salaries. We need to get rid of high stakes testing. It's not, both eliminated from the credentialing programs are massive equity issues. And the research also shows strongly that if you match a student's race or ethnicity with the teacher's race or ethnicity, then you're going to have higher results as a consequence. That ethnic matching is an absolute finding in research. I can share that if you want with this group. But I think if we don't do that, if we don't diversify our universities, we're not going to ever have the teacher pool. So I want to see our minority serving institutions step up to the plate as well on teacher preparation. But we need to have a social movement, and the federal government needs to support this.
And this was wonderful. I cannot thank you enough for sharing your expertise and your personal stories in the context where you work and understand the dilemmas and also some possible solutions. So I'm going to turn it over to Taylor for some concluding remarks.
I just want to say thank you to the panelists. You all had some incredible insights, and I really appreciate hearing from you as someone who's still trying to learn about this area of study. I also want to commend our attendees. We've had an incredible retention rate. So thank you for sticking with us. I would also like to acknowledge that this topic seems to be very important to legislators. So I could see us doing more fact sheets on this topic later this year, even touching on We do have some materials already related to grow your own programs. Happy to send that to attendees. I think that if we could also touch more on some of these topics related to bureaucracy, Angela, this idea of ethnic matching is really interesting to me. So we'll be following up with you about that, and other sorts of incentive structures for teachers in different complex situations would be really interesting to dig into further. So again, thanks all for attending. I also thank you for being here on a Friday. So I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. And thank you, Francesca, for doing a beautiful job moderating. I really appreciate you so much right now. Thank you. And have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.